Imagine a child, barely 8 years old, ripped from his family's arms in the dead of night. His crime? Being too beautiful. His punishment? A lifetime of servitude to men who saw him as nothing more than a breathing ornament, a living toy to be dressed up, displayed, and discarded at will. This was no isolated tragedy, this was a systematic horror that devoured tens of thousands of China's most vulnerable boys for over a millennium. They called them opera singers or scholarly companions to mask the brutal truth. These children were prisoners in silk cages, forced to smile while their souls shattered, trained to sing while their hearts screamed. Picture the moment a desperate mother sold her son to traffickers, convincing herself he'd have a better life, serving the wealthy. Imagine that boy's first night in captivity, alone and terrified, as strange men discussed his potential like livestock at auction. Feel the weight of iron shackles disguised as golden bracelets, the sting of beatings hidden beneath powder and rouge, the hollow ache of performing joy while dying inside. For centuries, China's elite built their pleasure on a foundation of stolen childhoods and broken dreams. These boys weren't just exploited, they were erased. Their identities murdered so completely that most never even remembered their real names. Their stories have been buried for centuries, but today we uncover the chilling truth of their lives. You won't believe what they endured. You cannot turn away from what I'm about to show you. These children's screams echo across centuries, demanding justice, demanding to be remembered. Their blood is on the hands of history, and if we stay silent, it's on ours too. If this cuts deep into your soul, don't just watch. Act. Subscribe now. Like this video. Share their story. These voices will die forever unless we fight to keep them alive. Don't let history bury them twice. They've been lying to you. Every history book, every documentary, every museum exhibit about glorious ancient China, they've all been covering up the screams. While they fed you stories about wise emperors and beautiful art, they buried the evidence of an industrial-scale child trafficking operation that lasted over 1,000 years. Right now, as you're watching this, there are historians who know this happened. They have the records, they have the testimonies, they have the receipts for human beings sold like cattle, but they'd rather you admire pretty vases than confront the blood that paid for them. They've sanitized the horror, wrapped it in silk and called it culture. This wasn't some dark corner of society, this was mainstream. This was respectable. This was celebrated. The same men who built your beloved Great Wall, they were buying children. The same culture that gave you gunpowder and silk, they were perfecting techniques to break human souls so completely that victims thanked their torturers. Entire markets existed where you could browse boys like merchandise, inspecting their teeth, testing their voices, haggling over their virginity. Here's what they don't want you to know. For over 10 centuries, China's elite didn't just own slaves. They owned living art pieces. Boys who were surgically mutilated, psychologically shattered, and rebuilt as perfect companions. Most died during the preparation. The ones who survived? They were trained to compete for the privilege of being raped. They learned to paint their faces to hide bruises, to sing through broken ribs, to smile while their insides bled. And when these boys tried to escape, when they tried to remember their real names, when they showed even a flicker of rebellion, they were discarded like broken toys, replaced within days, their bodies thrown into unmarked graves, while their owners shopped for fresh victims at the next market, cash in hand, already forgetting the boy they'd just murdered through neglect. The academic establishment knows all this. They have the poems written by buyers bragging about their purchases. They have the instruction manuals for training these children. They have the medical texts describing the mutilation procedures. But mention male concubinage in Chinese history and suddenly they get very quiet, very academic, very complex cultural context. But the reality was far more tragic than anyone could imagine. You might think you know the history of China, but this dark chapter will change everything you thought you knew. The systematic dehumanization, the calculated cruelty, the sheer scale of this nightmare. It makes your skin crawl because it's real. In ancient China, beauty and intellect were commodities, but at what cost? Let's dive deeper into how the practice of male concubinage became a normalized part of society, and why those in power worked so hard to keep it hidden. Want to know how this nightmare began? It started with 3 simple words that destroyed millions of lives. Boys are prettier. Around 206 BC, during the Han Dynasty, some sick bastard looked at the traditional female concubine system and thought, you know what would make this even more twisted? Children. Male children. And thus began over 2,000 years of legalized child abuse that would make modern trafficking rings look like amateur hour. They called it Nan Chong, literally male favorite, as if giving it a pretty name could mask the stench of what it really was. But here's the thing that'll make your blood boil. This wasn't some underground perversion. This was respectable. This was fashionable. Having a stable of mutilated boys wasn't just accepted in Chinese high society, it was expected. Picture this. You're a wealthy merchant in Tang Dynasty China. You've got silk, you've got gold, you've got a nice house. But you're nobody until you own a boy whose screams have been surgically silenced. Your business partners judge you not by your profits, but by how refined your human collection is. The more broken and beautiful your boys, the more respect you command. And it wasn't just the ultra-rich playing this sick game. Government officials kept boys as bribes to their superiors. Buddhist monks, yes, monks, violated their own sacred vows to own these children, justifying it as spiritual companionship. Even middle-class families would bankrupt themselves to buy just one boy, because owning a male concubine was like driving a Ferrari. It screamed success. The demand was so massive that entire industries sprouted up around it. Professional trainers who specialized in breaking children's spirits, surgeons who perfected castration techniques to maximize survival rates while ensuring complete submission, makeup artists who taught boys to hide the evidence of their daily torture behind powder and rouge. But here's what really happened. China created the world's first industrial complex for manufacturing human suffering. They had supply chains, quality control, market research. They studied which regions produced the best boys, usually areas hit by famine where parents were desperate enough to sell their children. They developed breeding programs, identifying families with desirable traits and pressuring them to produce more sons. The scale is mind-numbing. Conservative estimates suggest that during the height of the practice, roughly 618 to 1644 AD, over 100,000 boys were trafficked annually. That's 274 children disappearing into this horror every single day for over 1,000 years. And those are just the ones who survived long enough to be counted. The geographical spread was total, from the imperial palaces of Beijing to remote mountain villages, from bustling port cities to desert outposts. Nowhere was safe. If you were a boy between ages 8 and 16, and you had the misfortune of being even moderately attractive, you were potential merchandise. Different dynasties had different preferences. The Tang preferred boys who could sing and dance. The Song dynasty favored literary talent. They wanted boys who could compose poetry about their own captivity. The Ming were obsessed with physical perfection, leading to horrific selection processes that discarded imperfect children like defective products. And the buyers? They kept detailed records like shopping lists. Purchased one boy, aged 12, castrated, trained in music and calligraphy, cost 50 silver taels. Human beings, reduced to inventory items, complete with warranties and return policies. But how were these young boys chosen, and who were the people willing to buy them? The selection process was a horror show that would haunt your nightmares. The process was deeply disturbing, as families had no choice but to sell their children to survive. Let's explore how the selection process worked and what these young boys had to endure. His name was Li Wei. 10 years old, he loved catching fireflies in summer evenings and listening to his grandmother's stories by candlelight. He had no idea that his beautiful voice, the same voice that made his family smile when he sang while helping with chores, had already marked him for death. Picture this, it's 847 AD. The harvest failed again. Li Wei's family hasn't eaten a real meal in weeks. His baby sister's crying has turned into weak whimpers. His father sits in the corner staring at nothing, because he knows what he's about to do. Then the talent scout arrives. Well-dressed, well-fed, carrying a purse heavy with silver. "Your son has potential," the man says, running his fingers through Li Wei's hair like he's examining a horse. "I can give him opportunities, education, a better life." The lies slip out smooth as silk while his hands probe the boy's face, checking his teeth, measuring his limbs. Li Wei doesn't understand why this stranger is touching him. why his mother is crying, why his father won't look at him. 30 silver pieces. That's what Li Wei's childhood cost, less than a good cow. The moment his family takes the money, Li Wei stops being human. He becomes inventory. The scout chains him to 12 other boys in a cart that reeks of piss and vomit and terror. The boy next to him, maybe 8 years old, keeps whispering his mother's name until his voice gives out. Another kid, clearly nobility from his soft hands, sobs uncontrollably until the guards beat him quiet. They travel for weeks. Li Wei watches boys die from fever, from infected wounds, from giving up. Their bodies get dumped on the roadside like garbage. No one mourns them. No one even remembers their names. They're just wastage. Acceptable losses in the supply chain. When they finally reach the training compound, Li Wei learns the first rule of his new existence. Forget everything. Forget your name, your family, your dreams, your very identity. You are not Li Wei anymore. You are Jade Phoenix, and if anyone hears you use your real name, you'll be beaten until you can't walk. The preparation begins immediately. They shave his head, dress him in silk robes, and paint his face with makeup that burns his skin. Then comes the examination. Older boys spreading his legs while buyers probe him like a medical specimen, discussing his potential and market value, as if he's not even there. This one's perfect for castration, one buyer notes, pressing fingers into Li Wei's stomach. Look at that bone structure. He'll feminize beautifully once we cut him. Li Wei doesn't understand the words, but he understands the tone. He understands the way they look at him. He understands that whatever they're planning will hurt worse than anything he can imagine. The surgical preparation happens at dawn. No anesthesia, no mercy. Li Wei screams until his voice breaks, then screams silently until he passes out. When he wakes up, he's no longer whole. He's no longer entirely male. He's no longer entirely human. He's exactly what they wanted him to be. A broken, beautiful thing, dependent on their charity for survival. But this was just the beginning. What happened next was unimaginable, and there was no way to escape. The physical mutilation was nothing compared to what they did to his mind. Once taken from their families, their lives were never the same. But the real horrors began once they entered the homes of their new masters. This is where their true nightmare started. You want to know what makes this even more sickening? The same men who raped children by day were teaching virtue by morning. The same hands that beat terrified boys were writing poetry about compassion and wisdom. The same mouths that ordered castrations were preaching about moral superiority and enlightened civilization. Picture this nightmare. Master Kong, a respected Confucian scholar, spends his morning lecturing students about filial piety, how children are sacred, how family bonds are the foundation of society, how protecting the innocent is every man's duty. Then he goes home for lunch and sexually assaults the 12-year-old boy he bought last month. That night he writes beautiful calligraphy about righteousness and virtue, his hands still stinking of the child's blood. This wasn't hypocrisy. This was systematic mental gymnastics on an industrial scale. These monsters didn't see a contradiction between their noble philosophy and their child abuse, because they had convinced themselves that owning boys was actually virtuous. They called it educating the lower classes. They called it providing opportunity. They called it cultural refinement. Buddhist monks were even worse. At least the Confucians didn't pretend to have taken vows of celibacy. These holy men, these supposed representatives of enlightenment and compassion, were hiding rape dungeons in their temples. They'd preach about ending suffering while literally creating it. They'd talk about the sanctity of all life while slowly torturing children to death through neglect and abuse. And the most nauseating part? They wrote about it. They were proud of it. Countless poems survive from Tang Dynasty monks describing their beautiful young disciples and intimate spiritual connections. They documented their crimes in flowery language and called it art. They turned child rape into literature, and their followers applauded. The government officials were just as twisted. During the day, they'd draft laws protecting family rights and children's welfare. At night, they'd attend dinner parties where the entertainment was watching terrified boys perform while their owners discussed which child they'd discipline later. They created a bureaucracy of horror, official positions for managing child trafficking, tax codes for human property, legal frameworks for buying and selling human beings. But here's what really exposes their evil. They all knew it was wrong. Deep down, every single one of them knew. That's why they hid it from outsiders. That's why foreign diplomats never saw the boy quarters. That's why official records used coded language. That's why families who spoke out disappeared. They developed an entire vocabulary of lies to protect themselves from their own conscience. Boys weren't raped, they were educated in intimacy. They weren't tortured, they were disciplined for their own growth. They weren't slaves, they were fortunate recipients of cultural elevation. The language got more elaborate the worse the crime, as if pretty words could wash the blood off their hands. How could a society preach virtue while turning a blind eye to such monstrous actions? The truth is they did it because it benefited them. Every level of society profited from this horror. The poor sold their children to survive. The middle class used boys as status symbols. The rich treated them as investments. The government collected taxes on human flesh. Even the victims' families convinced themselves their sons were better off, because facing the truth meant admitting they'd sold their children to be tortured. But what about the young boys who suffered? What about Li Wei, bleeding and broken, listening to his master recite poetry about compassion? What about the thousands of children who died believing they deserved their torture because their betters told them so? But despite all this, no one questioned it. The practice thrived. Why? Because there was too much at stake for those in power. Too much money, too much pleasure, too much convenience. So, how exactly did this exploitative system operate? Let's take a look at how these boys were selected and trained, and what awaited them once they became concubines. Want to know exactly how they turned children into merchandise? Here's their sick playbook, the step-by-step manual for manufacturing human misery that they perfected over centuries. Step 1. The hunt. They called them Meiren Tang, beauty hunters. These vultures would swoop into villages devastated by floods, famines, or wars, carrying silver and sweet lies. They had checklists, for Christ's sake. Bone structure, delicate but not fragile. Eyes, large, expressive. Voice, clear, melodious. Age, 8-12 for maximum labability. Hands, soft, indicating no manual labor. They'd examine dozens of boys like they were shopping for horses, rejecting the defective ones without a second glance. Step 2. The purchase. Once they found their target, the negotiation began. Parents thought they were saving their child's life, giving him opportunities they could never provide. The hunters played into this desperation masterfully. Your son will learn to read, they'd promise. He'll live in a palace. He'll never go hungry. All true and all lies. The average price, 30 to 50 silver pieces, enough to keep a family fed for 6 months. The cost of a child's entire future. Step 3. The breaking. The moment the silver changed hands, the child's identity died. New name, new clothes, new reality. They'd be chained immediately, not just physically, but psychologically. Your parents sold you because you were worthless to them, they'd whisper. We're the only ones who see your value now. They'd strip away every connection to the child's past life, burning their old clothes, forbidding their real names, convincing them their families never wanted them back. Step 4. The journey of horror transport was deliberately traumatic. Dozens of boys crammed into carts, chained together, force-fed just enough to survive. They'd witness other children dying, being dumped, being replaced. The message was clear. You are disposable. Comply or die. Many boys broke mentally during these journeys. Which was exactly the point. Broken children don't resist. Step 5. The assessment EDA. At the training compounds, professional evaluators would determine each boy's market category. Pretty, but stupid. Pleasure slave. Intelligent, but plain. Academic companion. Beautiful and brilliant. Premium merchandise for the highest bidders. They had detailed charts categorizing children like livestock breeds, complete with expected prices and training timelines. Step 6. The mutilation. For most boys, castration wasn't optional. It was standard procedure. No anesthesia, crude instruments, survival rates around 60%. Those who survived the surgery were considered investment grade. Those who died were written off as business expenses. The living ones were left permanently dependent on their masters for medical care, creating psychological chains stronger than iron. Step 7. The programming now. Came the education. A systematic process of erasing the child's personality, and rebuilding it to serve their master's desires. Poetry lessons where they'd write verses praising their captors. Music training where they'd learn to sing through pain. Philosophy classes where they'd memorize teachings about accepting their fate with gratitude. Every lesson was designed to make them complicit in their own destruction. Step 8. The final product. After months or years of this torture, they emerged as finished concubines. Beautiful, talented, and completely broken. They could compose poetry about their rape, paint pictures of their torment, and smile while their souls screamed. They were living masterpieces of human destruction, and their masters were proud of their creation. Once purchased, their real training began. But it wasn't just about beauty. They were groomed to be intellectuals, trained in poetry, music, and philosophy. But was this really an opportunity or another form of enslavement? The education was the cruelest joke of all. And as these boys were trained, they began to realize just how high the price of beauty and intellect truly was. But how much could a boy really learn in a system designed to break them? Their lives were a blur, each day a haunting repetition of grooming, memorizing lines and rehearsing performances. Always bending, always striving to please, always preparing to be someone else's ideal. The air was thick with fear. Any hint of resistance was met with ruthless violence, erasing even the smallest shred of hope for escape. Most of the boys never saw their families again, and for those who were permitted such rare visits, they returned only as ghosts, broken in mind, spirit, and body. The children they once were had long since been buried. The world they knew before their capture, the warmth of their mother's embrace, the laughter of their friends, the scent of their village, became nothing more than distant echoes, fading with each passing day. What remained was a hollow shell, a child forced to become an object, a tool of someone else's desires. They were beaten into silence, molded into perfection, their hearts slowly turning numb, drained of all color and life. Can you even begin to imagine what that must feel like? To wake every morning knowing you have no future, no family, no past to hold on to, only the weight of someone else's cruelty pressing you further into the earth. A life where every attempt to hold on to yourself is met with punishment, until you're left a hollow vessel, drained of everything that made you human. And as the years passed, their beauty, the very thing that had once protected them, began to fade. Their once silken skin wrinkled, their eyes lost the youth that had once made them desirable. But their masters? They didn't care. They simply discarded them, as if they were used goods, and moved on to the next young face, the next victim whose innocence hadn't yet been shattered. What happens to them now? The ones who are no longer needed, no longer wanted, those who have outlived their usefulness in a world built only on their beauty and obedience. What becomes of the broken, the discarded, when the very thing that gave them worth is gone? Time was the cruelest master of all. By their mid-20s, these men who had once commanded attention with their beauty found themselves facing an inevitable truth. Their value was fading, along with their youth. The same officials who had once competed for their company now barely acknowledged their presence. The same merchants who had paid fortunes for their services began looking elsewhere. What happens to a man whose entire identity has been reduced to his appearance when that appearance begins to change? These concubines watched helplessly as newer, younger faces arrived to take their place. The elaborate robes were passed to others. The private chambers were reassigned. The invitations stopped coming. Most were simply abandoned, cast out with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a lifetime of trauma they could never speak about openly. They had no family connections to fall back on, having been severed from their roots years earlier. They possessed no marketable skills beyond what had been demanded of them in service. Society offered no safety net for men whose only crime was surviving a system designed to consume them. Some tried to reinvent themselves, taking whatever work they could find as servants, laborers, or street performers, but the stigma followed them like a shadow. Former concubines were marked men, neither fully trusted by respectable society nor welcome in their communities of origin. Others couldn't bear the transition, the psychological toll of years spent as ornamental objects, valued only for their bodies and compliance, left many unable to form genuine relationships or find meaning beyond their former roles. Depression, addiction, and suicide claimed far too many who had once been prized possessions. The fortunate few who managed to save money or earn genuine affection from their patrons might secure modest support in their later years, but these were rare exceptions in a system designed for disposal, not dignity. History records that some sought desperate escapes, fleeing to distant provinces, joining rebel groups, or disappearing into the criminal underground. But few ever truly made it out alive, not in any meaningful sense. Even those who physically survived carried the scars forever. And as we look back at this practice, we have to ask ourselves, how could a society allow such cruelty to continue for so long? What does this teach us about power, wealth, and exploitation? The stories of these forgotten men remind us that societies can normalize the most horrific practices when they serve the interests of the wealthy and powerful. What happened in ancient China wasn't an aberration, it was a deliberate system designed to transform human beings into commodities for the pleasure of elites. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This didn't happen because ancient Chinese society was uniquely evil. It happened because power always seeks to justify itself, and wealth always finds ways to purchase what it desires, regardless of the human cost. The philosophical justifications, the cultural narratives, the elaborate ceremonies, all of it was window dressing on a simple transaction. The rich buying the right to own other human beings. The exploitation of these men is not merely a relic of the past gathering dust in history books. It echoes in every corner of our modern world, where human trafficking flourishes, where people are bought and sold like livestock, where the vulnerable are preyed upon by those with resources and connections. The methods may have evolved, but the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged, power consuming the powerless while society looks the other way. We see it in the sex trafficking rings protected by wealthy clients. We see it in the migrant workers trapped in debt bondage. We see it in the children forced into labor while their products fill our stores. The same combination of economic incentive, social indifference, and institutional protection that enabled ancient China's concubine system enables modern slavery today. How many more victims are hidden from view right now, their suffering conveniently ignored because acknowledging it would be inconvenient? How many times will we allow history to repeat itself before we stop looking the other way and start demanding justice for all those who are treated as property rather than people? And as we look back at this practice, we have to ask ourselves, how could a society allow such cruelty to continue for so long? What does this teach us about power, wealth, and exploitation? These young men, whose names have been erased by history, deserve to be remembered, not as objects but as human beings who lived, suffered, and died in a system that robbed them of their dignity. They had dreams that were crushed, families they were torn from, and futures that were stolen before they could even imagine them. Every single one of them was someone's son, someone's brother, someone who laughed as a child, who had hopes, who felt pain and fear and longing just like you do, but history reduced them to footnotes if it mentioned them at all. The same society that consumed them also erased them, ensuring their suffering would remain invisible and their stories untold. We cannot bring them back, we cannot undo their pain, but we can refuse to let their experiences disappear into the silence that power prefers. We can name what happened to them for what it was, systematic dehumanization on a massive scale. We can honor their memory by refusing to look away from uncomfortable truths. Their voices were silenced, but ours don't have to be. If you believe that the world needs to know this history, take action now. Hit that subscribe button, like and share this video with your friends and family. The stories of these forgotten victims need to reach the world, and only you can help make it happen. Don't let their pain be silenced. Don't let history repeat itself in darkness. Share their story. And as we look back at this practice, we have to ask ourselves, how could a society allow such cruelty to continue for so long? What does this teach us about power, wealth, and exploitation?